When people think about medieval warfare, they usually picture knights in armor, open battles, and dramatic charges across the field. But for many soldiers, the worst part of war was not the battle itself. It was siege duty. Standing for weeks or even months outside a castle wall meant cold, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the constant risk of sudden death. In many ways, it was less about fighting and more about enduring misery. And that is exactly why siege duty may have been the most miserable job in medieval warfare. Number 1. No glory. In medieval Europe, the famous image of war is a knight charging across an open field. But that was not the job most campaigns kept coming back to. Castles and walled towns were the real targets, because they held wealth, administration, workshops, roads, crossings, and political control. That meant siege warfare was not some side activity. It was one of the central ways medieval rulers tried to take land and keep it. So if a soldier was assigned to siege duty, he was not being sent into a short burst of action. He was being dropped into the slowest and most exhausting kind of war the period could offer. A siege could end in 3 ways: a successful assault, a negotiated surrender, or failure by the attackers. And because a full assault was so dangerous and expensive, commanders often tried everything else first. For the ordinary man in camp, that meant days turning into weeks, while he guarded roads, carried supplies, covered engineers, watched the walls, and waited for orders that might never come. Even the feudal system added to the strain. In theory, military service could mean war, escort duty, or guarding a castle, and the normal period of knight service was about 40 days a year. But long sieges could last far beyond that, which meant rulers had to start paying troops or risk seeing the whole operation lose momentum.
So right from the start, siege duty mixed bad food, uncertain pay, hard labor, and a constant sense that the real fight might still be far off. A field battle could be over in an afternoon. A siege could swallow an entire season and still leave everyone filthy, hungry, and no closer to the gate. Number 2. The camp. Once the army settled outside the walls, the first reality of siege duty was camp life. And camp life was rough even before the shooting started. A large siege camp was not just a line of tents. It was a temporary town built in hostile territory, with soldiers, servants, horses, carts, work crews, and all the support people needed to keep the army in place, all packed together around one job. Medieval commanders knew that a bad camp could ruin an army. Military manuals warned against staying too long in one place, against camping near swamps or foul-smelling ground, and against letting waste build up inside the camp. Sanitary needs were supposed to be handled outside. Water had to be protected. Horses were not supposed to foul the same water the men drank. On paper, that sounds sensible. In practice, thousands of people and animals pressed into one area still produced mud, stink, spoiled food, contaminated water, and disease. Most men also had very little shelter beyond fabric, wood, and whatever they could improvise. So rain, cold nights, and damp ground wore them down fast. That was one reason soldiers often suffered badly during long sieges. The longer an army sat in one crowded camp, the more likely sickness became. And the camp itself had to be maintained every day. Ditches, paths, cook fires, storage points, guard posts, animal lines, and work areas all had to be organized and defended.
By the mid-14th century, large siege camps in northwestern Europe could develop enough infrastructure to look like temporary towns in their own right, which sounds impressive until you remember that these towns were full of anxious men, sleeping lightly, working constantly, and knowing that one outbreak of disease could do more damage than the enemy on the wall. Siege duty began with the camp because without the camp, the siege could not continue. and living in that camp was already miserable work. Before a wall was broken, the camp was already grinding men down.
Number 3, the labor. Then came the actual work, and this is where siege duty stopped looking anything like the romantic version of medieval warfare. Most soldiers were not spending their day in heroic single combat. They were hauling timber, dragging stones, carrying bolts, filling ditches, cutting brush, and building protection so other men could get closer to the walls. At Kenilworth in 1266, Henry III's army brought 2,000 wooden hurdles, which were basically portable screens to shield troops from missiles, along with 60,000 crossbow bolts and 9 siege engines. That detail says a lot. A siege needed a mountain of material, and somebody had to move all of it by hand. If the plan was mining, trained diggers worked under the walls through a horizontal tunnel, propped the cavity with timber, then burned the supports to bring masonry down. If the plan was bombardment, crews had to set up stone throwers, giant crossbows, or counterweight trebuchets, then keep them supplied and working. If the plan was escalade, soldiers had to move ladders into position while archers tried to keep defenders' heads down. Even the famous battering ram only mattered if a crew could push it into place and keep swinging while defenders tried to smash it, burn it, or hook it apart. Siege towers, when they were used, were even worse. Huge, rolling structures full of men, ladders, and exposed wood, all of which had to be assembled, moved, and protected. The biggest trebuchets were enormous machines powered by heavy counterweights, and even if a chronicler exaggerated what they could do, the basic point stands. They took time, crews, tools, and a steady supply system to stay effective. And every machine needed ammunition. Rounded stones, bolts, timber, rope, iron fittings, and replacement parts had to keep arriving, or the whole attack stalled. That is why sieges relied on specialists such as engineers, miners, and artillery crews, but also on ordinary soldiers doing heavy, repetitive labor under pressure. For many men, siege duty felt less like battle and more like running a construction site that the enemy was trying to kill every minute. Number 4, the fire. All that labor happened under the wall, and under the wall was exactly where defenders wanted you. Medieval fortifications were built to make attackers suffer on the approach. Soldiers climbing ladders were exposed to arrows, bolts, stones, and scalding liquids. Men working with rams or drills had to do it from inside wooden shelters because standing in the open was an invitation to die. Defenders stocked arrows, bolts, stones, timber, earth, and repair material, and they could push ladders away with long poles, drop missiles from wooden galleries, or answer mining with countermines. Bombardment was not just about breaking stone. It was meant to create fear, injuries, fires, and confusion. At Dover in 1216, Louis of France managed to undermine the Barbican, attack the main gate, and bring down a tower, creating a ramp of rubble that let his assault force break into the outer bailey. Even then the job was not done. Hubert de Burgh's men fought them back and drove them out through the breach. That is the brutal logic of siege duty. Even when you finally get the wall to fail, you still have to go through the gap against people who are waiting for exactly that moment. And it did not end with direct attacks. Garrisons could launch sudden sorties, wreck siege works, burn equipment, or hit workers when they were least ready. At Kenilworth, the defenders answered royal pressure with open defiance and aggressive raids from the castle. Siege warfare also used psychological pressure, including public punishment and displays meant to shake morale. So the ordinary soldier lived in a strange rhythm. For hours, nothing happened except noise from the wall.
Then suddenly missiles were flying, alarms were shouted, smoke was rising somewhere in the works, and what had felt like boring camp labor turned back into immediate survival. Number 5. The wait. That rhythm leads to the part people usually underestimate, which is the waiting. A siege was often a contest in patience long before it became a breach and a storming party. Blockade meant stopping anyone and anything from getting in or out. That sounds simple, but it turned into endless guard duty. Men had to watch roads, river crossings, paths, gates, and supply routes day after day because one missed wagon, one messenger, or one relief convoy could undo weeks of work. Meanwhile, the defenders, if they had prepared well, were not helpless. They stockpiled food, drink, missiles, timber, stone, and repair supplies, and many strongholds had wells or cisterns for water. That forced attackers to settle in for the long haul. The problem was that the besieging army also had to eat, drink, and stay together in enemy country. One economic historian's summary is blunt. Attackers often suffered more than the besieged because of poor shelter, disease, food shortages, and the danger of a relief force appearing behind them. That is one reason commanders frequently leaned toward negotiation when they could. The longer the siege lasted, the more expensive it became, and not just in money. Morale wore down, discipline slipped. Men started thinking about home, pay, and how much longer they were expected to stand in the rain for somebody else's castle. Once traditional service limits expired, rulers had to keep men by wages or other arrangements, which added another layer of pressure on the whole operation. Kenilworth is a good example of that strain. The siege lasted 172 days and became so ruinously expensive that Henry III ended up pawning jewels from the shrine of Edward the Confessor. That is what siege duty did even to kings. For ordinary soldiers, the pressure was simpler. Every extra day meant another watch, another ration, another repair job, and another night of broken sleep. A blockade only worked if the ring around the stronghold held day and night, so fatigue became part of the weapons system. Men who were too tired to notice movement, too hungry to stay sharp, or too angry about pay to keep discipline, could damage the siege as surely as a failed assault. That is why siege duty could feel so draining even when nothing dramatic seemed to be happening. The wall was still there, the enemy was still there, and the job still had to be done again the next morning. Number 6. Inside the walls. And if the attackers had a miserable job, the defenders were not living well either. In peacetime, a small castle might have only a dozen soldiers or even fewer, just enough to work the gate, the drawbridge, and the patrols. Once a real threat appeared, as many men as possible were crammed inside, often along with civilians, servants, and huge stores of supplies. That made every problem worse. Space got tighter, food had to stretch further, waste piled up faster, and sleep became harder. Defenders had to keep watch, repair damage, move ammunition, fight fires, answer mines with countermines, and prepare for the possibility that every bombardment was the start of an assault. At Dover in 1216, around 140 knights and perhaps 1,000 sergeants held the fortress for the crown, which shows how many people might be packed into one place when the stakes were high. Kenilworth's garrison had also prepared seriously. By the time Henry's army arrived, more than 1,200 people inside had built food stocks meant to last for months. Even so, time wore them down. After 172 days, the defenders were left with only 2 days of food, and dysentery had badly weakened the garrison. Conditions inside a castle could also be deeply unpleasant in ordinary physical ways. Soldiers slept in dormitories or wherever space could be found.
Toilets often emptied into pits, onto the ground outside, or into the moat, and bad smells were widely associated with illness.
In a crowded siege, that kind of sanitation was one more burden, not a small detail. English Heritage's plain description of long sieges is worth taking seriously here. Starvation could push defenders to eat animals they would never normally touch, and even chew on leather. So the castle was not some comfortable safe zone while the attackers suffered outside. It was a loud, crowded, foul-smelling pressure chamber where everyone knew the walls might crack, the well might fail, or the rations might run out first. Siege duty from inside the walls replaced mud and exposure with confinement, rationing, and the slow pressure of being trapped.
Number 7. The real job. When you put all of that together, siege duty starts to look like the least glamorous but most typical kind of military service in medieval Europe. It pulled in knights, but also sergeants, miners, carpenters, crossbowmen, laborers, engineers, and paid professionals who knew how to keep a fortress under pressure. Castles mattered because they were not just walls. They were headquarters, storehouses, observation posts, safe points for armies, and centers of local control. Leave one active in your rear, and it could threaten your supplies and communications, which is why rulers kept coming back to sieges even when they were costly and slow. For the soldier, that meant war was often a mix of sentry duty, hauling, digging, building, and brief moments of very sharp violence. He might spend a week helping raise an engine, another week guarding it, and only a few minutes actually fighting hand to hand. The outcome might not be decided by a glorious charge at all, but by whether one side ran out of food, money, health, or nerve before the other. Even the camp reflected that reality. Large siege camps could develop into organized temporary towns because so many different kinds of work had to happen at once for the pressure on the walls to continue. That also helps explain why so much medieval military innovation focused on forts, engines, mining, protection screens, stronger gatehouses, and supply, rather than on one perfect battlefield maneuver. The more effective siege methods became, the more defenders answered with deeper walls, better towers, stored missiles, countermines, and layered defenses inside the gate. Before gunpowder weapons began changing siege warfare in the mid-14th century, this grinding pattern was one of the clearest signs of how medieval war really worked. Not fast, not clean, and not especially heroic from the soldier's point of view. Just a long test of endurance where courage still mattered, but stamina, labor, discipline, and sheer tolerance for misery mattered just as much.